Talk about guns now. So I guess we could just start by having everyone tell us what you think about guns, and let's start with just specifically gun control. Like, what are your views on that? And we'll start there. Why don't you start first, Sean?
So for me, I definitely believe in like the Second Amendment. We should be able to have guns. I think with gun control, my stance is it's kind of the same thing with capitalism. I think there needs to be some kind of like some checks for people to buy guns. They can't be as easy to obtain as they are today. I'm not sure what those checks are yet. I know for sure like we should do more extensive background checks, but maybe even more of like psychological checks. Where it starts getting the gray zone for me is taking guns away from people that have like mental illnesses. Because where do you draw that line where that person's depressed, you take their gun away? Or that person, So, I mean, that's my stance. But I agree with, like, minimizing, like, bullet capacity, the automatic weapons.
Some more moderate regulation.
Well, what do you mean specifically by automatic weapons?
So, full auto.
Okay.
I think semi-automatic.
Isn't it legal in some states though?
No, it's illegal, federally illegal to have a fully automatic weapon unless you have a Class 3 weapons permit, which is.
So is that law enforcement?
Law enforcement can have them. You can get it as a civilian, but it's really difficult. It's really expensive, and you have to go through a huge background check and stuff.
But then we have laws where like you can't tape another magazine to the back of another magazine for like easy reload, and then you have to like there's a lot of laws for 10 magazine rounds.
10 rounds per mag.
Yeah.
No.
So I mean, I agree with all of those. I mean, yeah, that's my stance. I think I just want to talk more about if you guys agree with like having more checks and balances for when people are ready to buy a gun, and maybe extending that period to, and maybe even having to go to a safety class. I don't know.
So, first, before we concede those, what do you propose in terms of like magazine capacity limitation and the semi-automatic weapons?
So, I mean, those are more just to cut down on if somebody wants to create, like, a mass shooting, it would be harder for them to do it. They either need a lot of guns all loaded, or they have to have a lot of, be really efficient with changing magazines. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're just cutting down the factor that somebody can spray 100 bullets, from a crazy big machine gun.
Sure. Well, I definitely think that there's good reason to limit fully automatic weapons. I would say that the effect of limiting magazine capacity is pretty minimal in terms of the reduction of violence.
So I agree. I think the biggest step, I think those somewhat work, but the biggest step is before you let somebody have a gun, I think we need to come up with some kind of test. Like we already do a small background check, but that's pretty much if you're a felon or have assault charges.
Yeah, basically only a felony, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
But then you're checking the well-being of a human being, and so where do you draw that line that they're able to own? Because you're taking it's a constitutional right.
Right.
So where can you draw that line saying? We're taking that away.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's also interesting because I think a lot of people, when they talk about gun control, they have the idea of limiting mass shootings in mind. So I think it's not unwarranted, right? Those are bad things. We don't want them to happen anymore, and we should definitely be trying to mitigate that. But from the perspective of limiting violence as a whole and reducing the number of murders with guns, mass shootings are essentially a rounding error on top of the actual homicides that get committed with guns. So I think it's important to distinguish between the purpose of your legislation. So if you want to limit mass shootings, is that your goal? Or if you want to limit just gun violence on the streets, if that's your goal. Because those have fundamentally different ideas behind them. And I think
definitely the main animating force in the desire for more legislation is around mass shootings and specifically school shootings.
Yeah, I would agree.
The killing of children is definitely
Yeah.
unacceptable.
So, before we get into the specifics of laws around trying to deal with that, I want to ask if you guys think that it's a good idea to have armed guards at schools. What do you think about that?
I think so. I mean, I know they have it at most high schools nowadays.
Obviously, they got to be well trained. That's a huge part of.
Right.
Like, I think that's a huge problem with the police and security guards in general. Is they just don't have good training, and so we need to make sure that they're really well trained. But if they are well trained, I think Sam Harris, this is one of the things that he talks about, where if you're at your work that's like a gun-free zone and there's somebody going through the offices shooting everybody, you're not gonna in that moment be thinking, man, I'm so glad that no one here has a gun besides this dude.
Yeah.
So I think making gun-free zones is fundamentally ineffective and honestly counterproductive in a lot of ways.
I mean, there is definitely that argument, like, to fight a gun, you need a gun.
Yeah. And people often point out that having somebody with a concealed weapon around when there's a shooting, they're just going to have the possibility to shoot civilians, or they're just going to add to the chaos, or when the cops get there, they're going to think that it was him.
I have heard police departments put out that line of reasoning.
Yeah, I think it does in some ways complicate their job, but when you talk about actually wanting to stop shootings before they happen, you gotta have somebody there that has the capability to do that.
And I do think we should do more concealed carry for, I mean, it goes back to a check. People that apply for it, we should give guns to people that have proven themselves to be good
totally.
people in society.
It's funny because people with concealed weapons permits actually commit fewer crimes than cops do. So there's really this fundamental confusion, I think, about what giving people concealed weapons permits actually does. So I think the argument against concealed weapons is pretty unfounded in most cases. And I think having gun-free zones, you're really just guaranteeing that guy doesn't have to worry when he walks in there. They're just saying like, oh, there's no guns in there? Great. I don't even need my bodyguard today.
That being said, the idea to me that, the solution to our, crazy school shooting problem is to have, armed teachers. I mean, it's just so gross to me. I don't know. I feel like there's more root issues than that, and I feel like that's just...
I don't think that's the solution either. But I do think if the teacher wanted to go through a rigorous course,
self-sought. But the idea that that's the solution to this problem really grosses me out.
I agree with that too.
Do you think that it hinges on guns? Do you think that feel like that's the factor that needs to be focused on at school shootings? Like, I get that without...
I don't know. This isn't a topic I have a firm stance on.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of different arguments going on here. I think more to do with the problem with school shooting. I think the availability of guns is part of why it happens. But I think it has a lot more to do with the, socioeconomic turmoil in this country. I think it has a lot more to do with the disenfranchisement of, especially white males. And let me be clear when I'm saying that, we're transitioning out of an era where, white men expected that they'd be able to go into the workforce and get a job with a living wage and raise a family on one income. And, now we have, we need two income households, gender relations are changing. There's a lot of economic distress and political disenfranchisement. Combine that with the fact that our culture is pretty violent. I think there's just a lot of bigger issues at play. And I don't think just dealing with guns is going to solve the problem, although I think the availability of guns in that context certainly contributes.
I agree with you in a lot of ways. I think bans on any type of gun, I think I think the talk about gun control in the broadest sense is really a distraction from the underlying problems that cause these kinds of things. So specifically when we're talking about mass shootings, right?
Yeah.
So you think about the legislation that's been proposed to try and mitigate some of this, like, anything that sort of looks like an assault rifle you can't have, or no semi-automatic weapons, or, let's limit magazine capacity. These ideas are pretty unfounded in terms of their
Yeah.
actual possible effect. So when you look at what it takes, so I mean, this is going to sound, it almost borders on like an advocacy for no guns at all, because the idea that that's going to limit someone's ability to kill a bunch of people with guns is pretty stupid. If somebody spends a little bit of time with different types of guns, you start to get the sense that having a 30-round clip is nice, but you don't need it. So, you know, what I'm trying to say here is that, not that I think that we should ban all guns, and not that I think that having a 30-round clip limited wouldn't necessarily help a little, but mostly that it's not going to do that much. And I think people are going to be surprised by how little it does. So, for instance, the Virginia Tech shooting was done with handguns, right? So you can limit the clip size of a handgun too, but again, you're limiting it to 10 in most cases, which is, if you try to limit it more than that, you're starting to get into a self-defense argument where people that want to have handguns for self-defense have problems. And if you don't limit it, or if you leave it at 10, you're looking at somebody bringing 2 or 3 handguns and having the same kind of possibility. And having a rifle isn't necessarily an advantage in these close quarters encounters. You know, maybe it was for the Vegas guy, but he had fully automatic weapons anyway, so you're looking at a completely different case where the law probably wouldn't have helped anyway. And then again, you have the ability for someone to use a shotgun, which is probably fundamentally more effective in these kinds of cases. And you know, even a pump-action shotgun could be fired with roughly the same speed as a semi-automatic shotgun with very little training. I mean, maybe a couple days.
Did the Vegas guy have full auto? I thought he just had the bump stock.
You're right.
To make semi-automatic feel more like a full auto.
You're right. He did have a bump stock. I misspoke.
So he had an illegal. I know
Yeah,
Nevada. Well, I guess I can't say that. But you can get things in Nevada
Yeah.
that you like would be illegal in other states,
Yeah.
especially like round magazines. You can get bigger capacity.
Yeah, I'm certainly not above limiting the capacity, but I also think that it's more of a distraction. And it's also, so it's a distraction in 2 ways. One is only focusing on mass shootings, and that's a very small percentage of the actual gun violence, which again, it's horrific, and we should try to limit it however we can in, you know, without being ridiculous. But I think that mostly it's a distraction because that's not really what's causing the problem. You know, sure, like getting rid of the gun show loophole and making it so that there's some sort of like mental health check on whether or not you could have a gun would be good. But even then, you're looking at, you know, a friend having a gun that you take, or you know, like if these people really want to get the weapon, they're probably going to find a way. And it's really hard to make it so that they couldn't. And I feel like even more extensive background checks is not going to stop that problem. So I think the fundamental approach to solving the actual school shooting problem is with mental health and economic wellness. Because like if you make it so that people aren't poor and they have access to mental health counseling if they need it, then I feel like the incidence of this goes way down.
Yeah.
And then also the media's treatment of these.
See, that's a huge thing too. We have not only is the media incredibly sensationalist,
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have a culture that glorifies celebrity,
Yeah.
and those are bad.
And violence.
And violence, and
like,
those are
look
all
at
bad
our movies,
combos.
you know?
Yeah.
We aren't allowed to see, you know, genitalia, but we can see someone's head getting blown up.
Yeah, what's
and
John
it's
Lennon?
no big deal.
We have to make love in darkness, but we make violence in plain sight.
Yeah,
Something
exactly.
Like
I mean, Alan Watts says the same thing.
Yeah,
It's like-
it's pretty silly.
that. And there's, you know, I'm in favor of trying these smaller reforms, and you know, I think the biggest thing is it needs to be studied more in depth. I mean, the CDC is not allowed to study gun violence.
That is pretty
you know,
silly.
And I think
Anytime you limit what people can study, I think you're wrong.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest issues too is it's kind of become a political football.
Yeah, it's a huge one.
And you know, you have a problem where the people that know or more advocating for gun rights aren't trying to solve the problem.
Yeah.
So you have people on the right who are just like, no, shut up, don't talk about it. And so then people on the left who don't know what the fuck they're talking about, because generally they're not gun owners, but they're just like, dude, our kids are being shot. Like, we need to do something. So they're just like, fucking try anything. I don't know. And so I really think the impetus is on those who have more knowledge and more advocacy for gun rights to be more energetically trying to apply potential solutions to the problem.
I agree.
As far as like
I think they need to articulate better why their solutions that are proposed won't work, because they typically just say that's asinine.
It just becomes a tribal tit for tat,
Exactly.
and that's not going to solve the problem. But
But
another real quick thing I want to throw in,
Good.
when Dwight and I was talking earlier about the socioeconomic context, I would really advocate for people to check out Chris Hedges' new book, America: The Farewell Tour, because what he talks about is that in declining societies, it unleashes this psychological phenomenon we've seen a lot in history called the anomie, or the death instinct, and the way that declining societies kind of like unleash symptoms of that, and that one of those might be the rise of mass shootings as economic displacement
Interesting.
and other things.
I just think to get a gun, it's too easy. I mean, so there's mass shootings, but I think there's also just like gun accidents is huge. You're not even required to go through a training course on the gun you get. You wait for your background, takes like a week or two, and then you get your gun. You pick it up at a store.
A lot of times, especially in states that are more lenient, there's no waiting period.
So there's no background?
There's a background.
There's a background.
There's always a background check. That's federally mandated, but the waiting period is state by state, and lots of states don't have one.
And so you can walk out with the gun, but then they might take it back?
No. The background check happens within like 40 minutes.
Okay.
That's how it goes. So, I mean, I agree that we should definitely standardize, and we should make it harder to get a gun than just walking in and passing a background check. I advocate for essentially like a driver's license for guns, and you re-up it every 5 years or something like that, because it makes no sense that if you have 40 guns and then you go to buy a new one, you have to get a background check. Like, you already have 40 guns. Like, it doesn't matter if you get another one, right? But if you have a license that you just have like there's a few things that you have to do to maintain it, and then every however many years you have a retraining or a test or whatever to make sure that you're psychologically well off still, and that I feel like that's reasonable. I don't like it in a lot of ways because it's a little it's intrusive, but it's also
the counter argument
you have to do that for a driver's license anyway.
The counter argument is going to be well, driving is a privilege, but gun ownership is a constitutional right. So that's going to be the argument there. I personally agree with you. I think it's a great idea. It makes sense to me.
Well, we already limit gun ownership anyway, in terms of like if you're a felon, you can't have it.
Well, I mean, on principle, there's obviously limits to the right to bear arms, because you can't have a tank or you can't have a bazooka. Yeah. So the principle is already there. It's just a matter of where's the line.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a lot of qualms that I have about government oversight in general, and them having a right to say no to my right.
Right.
But I think it's not unreasonable. You could set it up in such a way that it wouldn't be unreasonable. And if you were able to do that in terms of, you pass a safety exam and psychological wellness, and then the background check, and then you get your license. And
see, I agree with the safety and the background. The hard part that I think people would disagree with is the psychological test.
Yeah, that's a really tough one.
And that's where we need more studying.
We need it a lot
on how our brains work. And
there's no justification besides purely political motives for not doing all the due diligence of research that we can.
Yeah.
There is psychological testing going on right now for that, though. There's you can't do research into the data, like CDC can't, but I know people here at OSU that are doing what happens when you see someone with a gun, what do you do, or how is your attention fixated on a gun versus the person holding the gun. There's plenty of that kind of stuff.
The thing that comes to my head is if you're depressed and you maybe even have thoughts of suicide, and you say that to the person, are they going to say you can't own a gun? Is that enough justification?
Yeah, where to draw the line is definitely an interesting topic, and I think suicide.
They could buy a knife and commit
suicide is the other thing that it's a different topic for me, because I might trip over myself here. I don't.
Careful now.
I know. Right? It's one of those times. If I was famous enough, I'd get misquoted by this. But thankfully,
we're still in that
I am.
that wonderful green zone.
I know, right? So taking away a weapon from somebody that's suicidal, I don't want to say that that's bad because, I think most people that are suicidal, if they get the proper help, can be brought out of that. And I think that's definitely what they should do rather than kill themselves. I think they should seek out help. And I think that it should be way easier to get that help in our society. And we need to do whatever we can to remove the stigmas around getting that help.
Well, mental health in this country in general is just atrocious.
It's abysmal. Yeah. And it's despicable that it is that bad.
In the developed world.
So that, I think, is the main thing that I think about with that. It's hard for me to want to say that if you're depressed, you shouldn't be able to have a gun. That's really hard for me to say. I think the clearest line is that if there's any indication that a professional has that you could harm somebody else on purpose, that's when I would say you shouldn't have your gun anymore. But as far as just being depressed, maybe there could be mandatory counseling or something like that. But I wouldn't say that you should take it away from them.
I'm relatively certain that and this is, obvious. So if you have depression, or saying that you're clinically diagnosed with that, is that what we're saying here? Because how are they supposed to know if you're not clinically diagnosed?
Yeah, maybe
most people go undiagnosed.
Yeah.
But even if we're like going down that trick, I'm pretty sure that I'm relatively certain that clinical psychologists, if they do hear that you're telling them that you want to harm someone and where it's going to happen and when you're going to do it, then they can tell the authorities.
Yeah.
But before then,
it's pretty blatant.
Even then you can't really do it.
Yeah. There's a lot. And it's important that you have those laws too, because otherwise those people won't say anything. Yeah. So it's confidentiality. It becomes this interesting gray area where if somebody really wants to harm someone, they have the wherewithal to hide that, then what test are you going to give them that's going to make up for it? It's going to cut through that somehow. So I think the idea that psychological testing could be effective in that realm is maybe a little idealistic, but it might be able to stop some. It might be able to stop some of them.
Unless there was a generalized psychological test that everyone had to go through, and then once you start seeing that kind of depression, then you say...
See, but I don't like psych exams en masse.
Yeah, the government.
That concerns me.
Demanding the psych
It's
exam.
kind of dangerous, right?
I don't know.
It's a tough
that would be
thing.
an interesting one to talk about.
Not that
I'd
they're
be
not
interested in
already
that.
going to be doing it just by analyzing our online behavior and shit. But
Right. God.
Dude, I think that teachers, I think that there is a vast amount more benefit that can happen for education than
I agree that there's a lot of benefit that could come from it.
Yeah.
It's an authoritarian age we're entering, I fear. So.
Yeah.
It can be for research and volunteer, but no way the government have control over everyone taking a psych exam.
Right.
I didn't say that. I meant for schooling and stuff like that.
I would be in favor of that if it was like highly confidential, but still, if that's on some database.
Well, if you have it,
it's not like the government wouldn't be able to take a peek.
But that's how all medical reports work.
That's true. And a lot of our medical information is sold by corporations and shit, so that's scary too.
That's scary. I would say having a psychological test before you can have a gun is tricky, but what you may be able to do is if you have like say we have this license set up, if you have a gun license, then you're required to go to a certain number of counseling sessions in a given amount of time, just like maybe even they're just once a year, like a check-in.
Yeah,
and then if there's something that the psychologist sees that's, maybe a little suspicious, they can require that you do more, and if you don't, then you lose your license. And then if there's some, like you could maybe set up some sort of criteria where if they really believe that you're going to harm somebody, then they get a second opinion, and then if that, they agree, then you can take it away. But it just gets really weird because, you have like, okay, what's the political bent of the psychologist involved, like are they liberal psychologists and they want to limit gun ownership, and then you have, just their fallibility in general, and so it's definitely a tricky area trying to limit one of those fundamental rights in that regard.
Yeah, real quick, I do want to touch on the whole civil liberty side of it, because I tend to be someone who's far more in favor of like civil liberties and erring on the side of civil liberties in general. So, as far as that goes, I'm a pretty I'm in favor of revolution, albeit nonviolent. As far as like the right to bear arms, I have a hard time imagining any revolution in a modern context being successful in a violent way. I think it needs to be mass civil disobedience.
I agree.
The only way I see guns being necessary in a civil liberty, like versus a tyrannical government context, would be if like we've already been taken over by an authoritarian government and it's just about resistance now, like physical resistance. So I'm not super worried about it in that lens, though I still want to protect the right of average citizens to keep guns. I'm not like a fervently on one side or the other there. And then there's this whole right-wing line that there's some conspiracy to like take away our gun rights. And I don't buy that either, even though I'm generally very sensitive to civil liberty infringement. I think most of our civil liberty infringement has been a bipartisan project, whether it's, freedom of speech or, privacy, with spying and all these different things. I just don't think those in power care very much about guns one way or the other. I think they just use it as a political football. I think there's moneyed interests on one side that, benefit off of, this issue as a political issue. Every time there's a mass shooting, gun sales go way up, the NRA money goes way up. The NRA is a big supporter of Republican candidates, and then Democrats, channel the anger of these, events to channel support on the left. So the fact that it's so tribalistic as opposed to bipartisan makes me feel like those in power don't really care one way or the other. It's just a political game. So I don't buy that whole, like, it's a conspiracy to take our guns thing.
I mean, that's the Trump. You should just watch his most recent rally because he literally says the Democrats are going to take your guns, like
he's been saying
referring
that
to
forever.
it to Nevada, and he uses it as a tool when it's just like blatantly not true.
Well, there certainly are Democrats that want that.
True.
But it's also they're parroting to their own constituents.
Yeah.
And whether or not they would actually do that is another question. But to me, the argument for guns is not in the realm of trying to overthrow the government, but rather a basic right for self-defense.
Right, totally.
That's probably the most compelling to
Me
a
too.
wide range
Yeah,
of
I
people,
want to
say.
be able to have a gun. I don't need it.
And-
Just a shotgun's fine for me or whatever. Like I'd like to be able to defend myself.
I think a handgun is pretty important for self-defense.
Yeah.
If you really want to be an advocate for self-defense, then a handgun is probably your most important point that you wouldn't want to give up.
Yeah.
I think shotguns are
Great
incredibly
for home
good,
defense,
incredibly
especially.
good for home defense,
Yeah.
and probably better than handguns in most cases. However, if you're in close quarters, it could be easier to take away. Those kinds of things. So handguns kind of the be-all end-all of self-defense in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I think. We're all guys here, but to be a woman in this world is a lot scarier in terms of what you face physically. Like I do a lot of jujitsu, and so even if I'm unarmed and there's one person attacking me, I have a chance that, like if they're untrained, I'm probably going to beat them up, right? And I'm probably not horrifically weaker than them, and I probably don't, I'm not outweighed by probably more than 50, 60 pounds maybe, unless they're really, really big, so it's definitely a different world when you start talking about a 100-pound woman who is untrained in anything
And unarmed.
Well, they're just targeted
and
more
so,
than I think.
and that's
of
the
course.
other
Yeah,
thing is
it's
they're
not just
obviously
self-defense.
way more of a target,
Yeah.
and so the nice thing about guns is that 100-pound woman can kill a 260-pound man with no effort at all, other than maybe some training, and definitely some training, I should say, and then being willing to do that. And so the equalizing part of it, I think, is just a huge compelling argument, and I think that saying that you want to take that away is allowing for a case where a woman can't defend her child, or like a lot of these things that could be solved by the right person having a gun in that instance. So that's one of the biggest arguments for guns that I have.
For sure.
Tangentially, I like to hunt. I think hunting is a much more sustainable way to eat meat, and so I think being able to hunt with a rifle or a bow is that's something that I don't think we should take away either. And it's one of those ways, going back to what we're talking about with the Native Americans, it's something that you can sort of get back to your roots in a lot of ways. And that whole cycle of providing for yourself and all that, it can be really beneficial for a lot of psychological reasons as well. So that would be why I would want to advocate for hunting weapons to be allowed as well. So those are my main arguments for.
I don't think very many people are worried about the hunting ones because most of those are like single fire or.
Yeah, I mean, some automatic hunting rifles or shotguns, you could certainly make a case that you could do a lot with those, especially
most of the
a well-trained
shootings.
person.
Like most of the mass shootings, and like I feel like most of those are with not hunting style. Like you don't go hunting with most of those guns.
Yeah, well, yeah. So the use of ARs in mass shootings is interesting because in most cases the advantage of the AR is not really levied, right? So the advantage of a rifle over a pistol is distance. It's much easier to fire accurately at a long distance. Velocity doesn't really come into play that much.
Does it have more gunpowder in a rifle round?
Yes, for sure, but that's not to say that would matter that much, is what I'm saying. You can get plenty of velocity out of a handgun, and if you're within 50 yards, the killing potential is not very different, depending on the round. There are certainly rifles that you could pick that would be more devastating than your average handgun, but there's lots of handguns that are incredibly devastating, and if you pick the right round, you're not really looking at much of a difference, depending on, there's lots of factors involved, right? Yeah. Like a rifle is more likely to go through like cover, so like wood and that kind of thing, depending on the round. Again, that's something that a lot of people don't recognize, is the round makes a huge difference. So the type.
Aren't they making some laws against like hollow point? Because like hollow kills way more than a normal bullet, right?
What?
Because it expands in the body and it damages the body way more.
Right. I don't know about any laws that they're making about that. Obviously, the Geneva Convention prohibits the use of hollow points, and so what we do with our rounds that we use in the military is we make them just stable enough in their rotation that they will continue to travel in a stable and controlled manner until they hit something, in which point they tumble. And so they sort of increase the size of the wound by tumbling within somebody instead of fragmenting, which is actually more effective in a lot of cases because it can go through cover, whereas hollow point's really bad at going through anything. Because it'll just shatter once it hits something. So a hollow point is actually fundamentally safer in terms of ricochets because it's going to shatter when it hits something. And then,
it might get a little fragmented, that's fine.
Yeah. It might be, if you're right next to it, it might be like a little mini frag grenade, but it's probably not going to penetrate very far. If you get hit with a hollow point, however, it can be very, very devastating. So I don't know if they're trying to limit that. I would guess that they'd have a hard time doing that if they were going to. But hollow points are not typically a hunting round either, so there is maybe some traction.
You're ruining the meat.
Yeah, and also you don't necessarily want a hollow point for killing an animal, because if you hit a deer in the shoulder with a hollow point, your bullet would fragment immediately without possibly going through any vital organs. So you essentially leave them with a surface wound instead of, if you had a soft point, it would probably break the bone and go through and kill the animal. Yeah. So it's just safer in terms of getting an ethical kill to use a soft point as your hunting round. And soft points will also mushroom a little bit. They just don't fragment in the same way. So anyway, as far as whether or not a rifle or a handgun is more deadly, there's a huge case to be made that a handgun would be worse for somebody to have than a rifle, because it's harder to take it away in a lot of cases, and much easier to conceal. Yeah. And you can have multiple handguns. You could have, like the Virginia Tech guy had 2. It wouldn't be that hard to have 4, So then you're looking at mitigating the problem of reloading, whereas trying to carry even 2 ARs would be really cumbersome. So when people say that ARs are a big problem, it doesn't really resonate with me very much. A lot of people say this based on the idea of like, why would anyone ever need that, right? And I think that's a pretty compelling argument. There's only a few cases of self-defense, where like multiple people are trying to come into your house or something, where you would need more than probably even 5 rounds. I would say 10 to be safe, especially if you're not overly well trained. But if you have multiple attackers, you might want more than that. And then again, home defense with a shotgun is probably a better option anyway, because you don't have to be as accurate. So anyway, it's hard for me to argue that ARs are an integral part of self-defense, and it's hard for me to say that I see a compelling reason to keep them. But I also find a huge problem with the idea that banning them would help really at all, because I think they would just use handguns at that point.
Well, the thing is, it's a style of a gun. It's not really much different than any other rifle.
Yeah. They just look scary.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing.
Here's a twist on the whole gun debate that I pretty much have never heard really talked about, but I've been thinking about a lot lately, is the history of, in like totalitarian right-wing regimes using guns to, use mob violence essentially to enforce totalitarian rule. So, for example, in the United States, there's a long history of whipping up mobs of reactionary right-wing, people to get their guns and go, terrorize some political group. There's a long history of that in the United States. You have a lot of guns hoarded by a very small percentage of people in this country. We're seeing this right now play out in Brazil. So right now there's a fascist, Bolosarno, and he's outwardly spoken about wanting to return to the former dictator. They've only had a democracy for a few decades, probably 30-something years.
It's been going great for him.
It was at first, and then there was a coup organized, like a soft coup organized by the wealthy business interests there to overthrow the elected president, put in a corporate puppet, made a bunch of things not work, and now the people are freaking out and they're falling into the hands of a demagogue. And they haven't had long to really cement any institutional norms of democracy. So, and Bolosarno, he's talked about wanting guns to be available to everyone, and that we should directly eliminate, the scum of society and shit like that. There's this argument which the right ignores, which is the threat of guns being in the hands of, mobs that are, influenced by totalitarian regimes. So
there's also,
and I could see that really happening in this country if it got bad enough.
That's not certainly a scary thought.
So in Mexico,
I don't know if there's a solution to that, but I'm just saying that concerns me.
There's groups of people in Mexico that are so fed up with the corrupt government and the cartel that they are taking their cities back. They're killing cartels,
arming themselves, and
So there's arguments on
both
sides.
Yeah,
and I can see where you're scared about, right wing in the United States.
Yeah.
But I think it's both sides, and I don't know if it's a good enough argument to take guns.
I don't either, and I'm not advocating that, but I do think it's a point of discussion that's not usually brought up, and usually right-wingers will say that taking guns is a purely left-wing notion. Or what was I going to say? Anyway, I don't think that's acknowledged on the right, the threat of gun mobs in history, especially on the right.
I would agree it's not acknowledged. I think the fundamental problem with even trying to deal with that issue in the U.S. is just the ubiquity of guns.
Yeah.
So to propose any kind of buyback program or anything where you get rid of guns, I just don't think it's going to happen here anyway. So then to think that we could somehow curtail the problem of possible mob violence, I just don't see a path forward.
My point I was going to make is that on the right, there's a talking point that authoritarian governments will always try to take away your guns, but we have examples of exactly the opposite as well, where they want people to have guns so they can rile up vigilante mobs to do the dirty work so they don't have to.
Well, it's become very different now that guns are not the be-all, end-all of war.
Right.
Back in World War II era, even, if you had a mob of people with guns, they were the same guns that were being used in War One, and they could make a huge difference if they wanted to. But now, one Apache just fucks your whole mob up with 2 rockets, and there's no recourse unless you have a 50 BMG and a ridiculously well-trained shooter.
Yeah.
I think the idea is guerrilla warfare. Like, if
Yeah.
we were
There's
taken
that
over
possibility,
where
but
it
then
was
you have
so bad.
thermal vision and
drones.
and drones. And
But it'd be the same thing. It's the problems that we're
Jesus.
dealing in the Middle East.
Yeah,
That's why
it
it's so
should
hard
be
to
said
fight
that-
those people, because they conceal the guns, they shoot up
Yeah.
a bunch of things, and then they hide their guns and
pretend to be
hide.
civilians. Yeah.
There is more to be said for guerrilla warfare than
Yeah.
I think we give it credit
So
for.
in a pot, yeah, like that's why it's so hard to fight.
But still.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty much on the ship of I want all the guns. You know, like I would personally love to have a fully automatic gun at some point, and I don't know if I'll go through the rigmarole to do it. But I also really like the idea of having suppressors, just because they're cool and they sound like it makes it so that it's much quieter when you shoot, which is just nice. But like.
Obviously, that has concerning implications, though.
Yeah, it could. Although I wouldn't necessarily say that having a suppressor should be as big of a deal as we make it out to be. Because
Yeah, it's a lot
They're
louder
still
than it is in the
fairly-
movies.
yeah,
and
it's
stuff.
much louder. And yeah. Anyway, there's that's a whole other discussion. And but I'm not hard and fast on these things. I'm not saying that I want to re-legalize fully automatic weapons or anything, but I do like ARs a lot, and I would like to have some, and I like the idea of, being ready for the zombie apocalypse and whatever. Not to say that I'll have my own bunker or anything like that, but I understand the mentality, and I understand the idea that, maybe if shit really did hit the fan, it'd be nice to think that you could possibly have some sort of recourse, and so fundamentally what it comes down to, though, is what would be the effectiveness of not letting that happen, of limiting ARs and all these other types of guns. And I don't see the case of the effectiveness of limitation being very compelling. I really don't. I think a good enough person with a bow could cause pretty big harm. And we've seen people in China go into schools and attack them with knives, and they've killed as many people in some cases as some of these school shootings. Obviously, knives are nowhere near as effective as guns, but to think that getting rid of the gun gets rid of the problem is pretty silly.
Yeah.
I agree, but I think there's some middle ground. I don't think we should be handing out automatic ARs to people if they want one. I think there still needs to be the checks.
Yeah.
And yeah, you can still cause damage with a bow, with a knife, with a car, with what, But like a gun is one of the easiest ways to cause a lot of damage. So if we can put a check on that, and then have as many people, good citizens, having concealed carry, and then have checks that people have to go through before buying a gun.
Yeah. I definitely think there's something to be said about that. I do think Sam Harris has another good point on this, where when we look at the deaths due to car accidents, they're pretty high, right? And we look at, I think they're like 30,000 a year every year reliably, according to him at least. I didn't check his number, but that's quite a bit higher than gun violence, and we kind of just accept that. We're just like, well, it is what it is, When if we really looked at it, we could govern all cars and make it so that they can't accelerate past a certain rate, or that they couldn't have a top speed past a certain speed, and we could even lower speed limits in almost everywhere, and we could govern cars to even lower speed limits, and we could definitely reduce that number of deaths. There's 100%. But essentially, people's reasoning for not doing that is driving wouldn't be as fun. Right? Like, what's the reason that we don't do that? And so then when we look at trying to limit gun violence, which is a smaller amount of violence, and it's kind of like, where's the moral equivalence there? I think there's definitely something to be said about that, where we sort of misattribute violence and problems, and we kind of forget about the statistics, right? Because guns are so in your face and nasty and scary, So anyway, I just think it's
that's
important.
almost the reverse of his argument from earlier, because you have
That's exactly the reverse.
yeah, you have cars
That's what I heard.
you have cars killing people accidentally, and then you have guns killing people on purpose, or people using guns to kill people on purpose.
Yeah.
So I think there's certainly something more shocking, more morally outrageous about that.
I guess
especially
you're
when
right.
it has to do with young children.
You're right. Moral equivalence is the wrong word, but I guess the idea that that gun violence is the biggest problem, you know,
Right.
or is a bigger problem than that. And to think that I'm taking this argument a little bit out of context, so like I'm not steel manning him properly, but to say that you're willing to limit guns just because like you don't want somebody to have an AR because they want the AR because they're fun, but you're willing to drive faster and, you know, not limit people's ability to do that because it's fun. It's different,
Right.
obviously.
Right.
But the fact that we're not willing to limit those things, but we're so eager to limit guns is, I don't know. It just seems like kind of a double standard. To
We
say.
do limit those things.
Yeah,
though.
we got speed
Well,
limit.
to be fair, we
we
do limit those
try.
things way
We
more
try.
than guns right now.
But I mean, Dwight
That's true.
did just,
Talking
like,
about
there's
licenses
a
again.
good point. Like, you could literally limit the amount of speed a car can go,
Yeah.
but we don't do it.
Yeah.
We could say you can't go over 80 miles an hour.
Yeah.
I've argued that, and I also think that that's probably gonna happen when we get electric cars.
Why?
Except it's gonna be, I mean, not electric.
Well,
sorry.
well,
Self-driving is...
if we fully
Yeah, then they'll go
automate
faster.
driving,
Exactly.
we go way faster.
Exactly. But the idea would be like it's the mistakes.
Yeah.
It's mistakes that
Yeah.
lead to the car deaths.
Yeah, and so I don't want to misrepresent him or my own ideas with that. I'm not saying that they are morally equivalent. I shouldn't have said that.
We just need guns that are programmed to only kill bad guys,
There you go.
and then we're good.
Easy.
Perfect
right?
moral arbiter. Great.
Yeah. Anyway, there's definitely
Read the face of the enemy to see if they're
Fucking
evil or
right.
not.
Exactly. No, see, this is where the psychological reports from earlier
there we
work really
go.
well. Like this one,
They
is
can have
high
a score.
tendency.
They can have a moral score
Exactly.
that pops up above their head inside the gun sight,
It's like the Black Mirror episode of like everyone
or like
walking
what
around
they're doing in
society
China right now in real life.
Yeah.
a rating.
It's crazy.
Yep.
But yeah, anyway, I would say just as like a last part of that, I'm not against gun legislation as a whole. I just think it needs to be done intelligently, and we need to look at it in the broader context of like, what are we trying to do? Will it be effective? And what other things should we be trying to do that are possibly even more impactful? I think getting outraged about school shootings and that kind of thing makes a ton of sense, and it's something that's super visceral to people, and it should be like it's crazy. But I think looking at, you know, mental health and the media and, you know, possibly having guards around there are going to be way more effective methods of curtailing that type of violence than going after the guns.
And I would like to, you know, put the impetus on those in favor of gun ownership to be more active in calling for measures that you think actually make sense.
Yeah.
And, you know, because in lieu of that, those who don't know stuff are, I mean, rightly going to be emotionally outraged and demanding action. And, you know, so those who know the most about the issue should be the most active to ensure that it's done in a logical way.
Definitely.
You know, so,
I think,
all that. Push for research, push for, you know, reforms that make sense. Don't be falling into the political, you know, playbook of the tribalism.
I think both sides need to be a lot better about that in general.
Mm-hmm.
And they need to be a lot better about coming together and talking about it and coming to an agreement on something. Because, like, with the instance of, you know, gun control, we have Democrats that are just saying, oh, we need to pick your part of the gun, you know, and they'll throw out anything. They'll be like, we shouldn't have guns with silver slides. And it's like, has nothing to do with
And then on the
anything.
right, you know, you have Republicans being like, "Oh, Democrats want to take your guns so they can put you in Walmart concentration camps." You know, like,
but my point was just that when you have Democrats throwing out crazy legislation like that, then they make the conservatives, the people that actually know about guns, mad because they recognize immediately that it's not going to do anything. And so then you just have this fighting that happens as opposed to coming together and being like, okay, what's actually going to help? You know, and being reasonable about those types of things. And, you know, I know a lot of gun owners that are more than willing to look at the holes in gun ownership.
Right.
But they hate when somebody proposes legislation out of this moral framework, thinking that they know and that, like, they can understand this and that them having